you look at stuff and think, oh, what a fantastic title this is. Value-based diagnostics in high-income countries. I've actually no idea, so I got some slides from other people, and you'll see as I struggle through this, I've actually got very little idea of what I'm talking about. But the idea again is A to be liked, but also to stimulate some thinking, some questions. Okay. So, I mean, the key trends. This is something that I guess everyone's aware of, but you know, globally the population is aging. But the interesting thing is it's coming from emerging markets as well. So China has got 121 million people over 65, which is more than the other major countries aggregated. So actually China in those emerging markets are really quite frightening. And you can see with 2020, China's going to have about an eighth of its population over 65. So that's one of the trends, is aging population, but also the rise in the emerging market. Life expectancy, again, there's a separation. Life expectancy is increasing, but healthy life expectancy is not. It's in a plateau. So what that kind of means is that as you get later in life, you become less well. And what it means is that you're alive but ill. So it's a concern for us all as we get older. One of the things that I think is quite important is we've talked a lot about infectious disease. Infectious disease is interesting in its own right, but in fact infectious disease in the context of underlying chronic disease is really where later in life you begin to see this separation in life expectancy and healthy life expectancy. Because most people will see, this is an example of COPD, you see a decline in your lung function over time. That is relatively well known. This is a paper from many years ago from Fletcher and Peter, but the decline is quite well known. Except if you smoke. If you smoke, you get a rapidly decline in lung function. If you stop smoking, then it goes back to that standard curve. And so you can see that in terms of chronic disease, it's generally manageable. However, if you overlay that with infection, you see that those people that have got frequent infections actually have a faster decline in lung function. And this is looking only over 4 years in the context of a disease that might take place, the terminal stage of disease might take place over 20 years. So infection has a substantial role to play in underlying chronic disease. And this is where rapid diagnosis, point of care diagnostics, so you think, what's emerging molecular diagnostics? Everything's moving towards point of care, nearer to patient testing. And this is a context where this type of testing really is a role, not just in identifying pathogens, but identifying pathogens in the context of chronic disease. However, even in terms of chronic disease, in terms of the prevalence and the incidence of major cancers, and when they're segregated out geographically, what we're finding, and this is just headlines from a couple of months ago from CR UK, on average, more than half the population will live 10 years and beyond for all forms of cancer. If you look at some very high incidence, previously high mortality cancers, earlier diagnosis is driving survival rates that are 80% for breast and prostate cancer out to 10 years. There are gaps, of course. You've got lung cancer, which is still a very prevalent, high incidence disease, and the survival rates are very poor. But generally, the introduction of earlier diagnosis is making an impact. When you look in developing world, you've got an incidence of breast cancer that's substantially lower than in developed world, but actually mortality rates are just as high. And that's because in the developing world, the use of these modern diagnostics is not yet as widespread. So it's extremely important that once the technology is developed, is in place, it is translated into use in developing world as well. And you can see, particularly in countries like India and other Asia-Pacific countries, there's substantial mortality still, even in the context of low incidence. The other idea to introduce is one of who are the stakeholders in all this. My background, as I mentioned this morning, is very much from industry, and we've tried to look at, where does industry get value from using molecular diagnostics in the context of treatments? Everyone knows that the problems for medicines are they need to be effective but also safe. Another change that's happening is that pharmaceuticals are moving from a blockbuster model that's based on high volume, low price, so one size fits all, to actually saying we can develop better medicines that are targeted at specific populations. That targeting is guided by diagnostics, but for that we need to set a premium price. So you're still seeing a blockbuster opportunity for pharma to make these billion-dollar sales, but the structure of the market is different. What that creates then is you've got these very high price therapeutics, so $100,000 per year in some instances, and then the diagnostic tests that guide those are actually substantially less, 100-fold less. So a $100,000 drug is a $1,000 test. Even more so with Zelbraf, again a melanoma treatment, the test is relatively cheap. So you've got an imbalance between the value that these diagnostics are bringing to the high-priced drugs and the actual pricing. And so we started to say, how can we model the impact of this price and create a value-based diagnostic? And this is where you start to see some really quite exciting numbers. We've not updated this chart, sorry, I did have data for this one. But you start to see a diagnostic priced at $120 actually has a value of $144 million. How do we model that? There's a simple way of modelling that. It's just looking at net present values plus and minus a diagnostic. You look over a drug life cycle, you make some assumptions, and you see a net present value uplift of about 1.8 billion over a 15-year life cycle. So that's one way of looking at this. What's the financial impact of net present value? Some other colleagues, Adrian Towes and Lou Garrison, have looked at how could you assess value and what would be the process for assessing value. And they're looking at the context of a diagnostic as a standalone. So again, it's assessed just on its price because it's diagnosing disease. But here you also have a diagnostic that's linked to a therapeutic, and you start to think, how do you extract the value? And you start to look at processes where either you're assessing the diagnostic on its own or you're doing a joint assessment. And this is the sort of process you're seeing with the FDA now. There's better link between an arm of the FDA called CEDAR and CDRH, the devices assessment program there. So you start to see joint assessment, and then you start to see that now with the EMA and MHRA as well. So joint value. And then just so people have a mark on the sand, the examples of value-based diagnostics in the market, I think in the previous session Stuart has talked about these things, the Oncotype malaprint breast cancer prognostic tests. So these aren't predictive tests, they're prognostic. They tell women about the risk of recurrent breast cancer. These are priced and reimbursed at $3,000. It doesn't cost the company that amount of money to make them, but what the vendors of these tests have done is they've created some very complex pharmaceutical-like healthy and economic modelling that says, in a healthcare system, these tests might save you $10,000 per annum or per patient, and therefore you should price the test at $3,000. And they're getting reimbursed that full amount by CMS and a number of private payers. Then you have our tests that identify the right responders, so you're targeting better, so there's more effective use of medicines. So EGFR is a classic for Herceptin. You've got other variations, different genotypes, and you've got Alkin fish for non-small cell lung cancer. So there's a number of examples out there that you can pick up from Lou's paper and the slides after the meeting. So then one last thought on stakeholders. The guys in the front line have some influence, and government regulators and payers have some influence. So here's something, I'm glad I put this slide in because this came up in a couple of discussions. The internet gives patients a phenomenal access to information. Some of that information may be right, it may be wrong, but the point is that even Mrs. Bloggs can go into a GP and say to him, actually I know a little bit more than you do, because this guy's working 24/7, he doesn't have time for continuing education, and the patient knows more. So GP education is a big part of getting adoption of new technologies into healthcare systems. And you've seen the story with the NHS, genetic mapping and all that stuff. But actually it's about capacity as well. The NHS doesn't have the capacity to deal with this sort of genetic testing. So that's a key issue, I think, in the developing world, is adoption. Another key driver is reimbursement. Health technology assessment agencies were really something that started in the UK with NICE many years ago, but NICE is now educating internationally. And some of the things that NICE says are, for instance, and he remains chief executive of the expanded NICE, Andrew Dillon says that the NHS will only pay for drugs when they've been proven to work. And this again is down to diagnostic testing. You're looking for a biomarker that indicates a response. So diagnostic tests aren't just important for guiding treatments, they're actually important for getting these treatments reimbursed. And that again is part of the value. Payers are beginning to push harder. This is a set of hospitals, and within America, there's the Obamacare brought in a thing called accountable care organisations. Accountable care organisations are acting, I believe, very much like health technology assessment agencies, and they're looking at the bit between this is a drug that works, but how much does it cost? They're looking again at the value of the drug in the test. And some of these payers and ACOs have got together to create this high-value healthcare collaborative. And again, it's really about how we can get value-based payment for diagnosis and value-based payment for treatments. So payers have an influence. Just to close out then, the simple way I look at disease and how we manage it is you're looking at an insult or a trigger event. There's always inflammation, then you get tissue remodeling, and you get symptomatic disease. So the way that we currently treat people is very much reactive medicine. You're looking at symptomatic disease. I think the medicine of the future, as we heard a few times earlier today, is really moving to this predictive medicine. Can we identify pre-symptomatic forms of disease before tissue remodeling, maybe at the inflammation stage, and actually use that predictive medicine to get earlier diagnosis combined with these new treatments, and therefore get a better long-term outcome. So that for me is the healthcare system of the future. Is this a healthcare system that's restricted to the developing world, or is it something that can be transferred into developing world? Is a question I think I'd like to hear discussed at that panel. And finally, I just want to thank colleague Lou Garrison in Seattle, Emily Stevens in Stanford, Martina Kaufman in Basel gave me some stuff on the German system I didn't have time to cover, and Ian Miller in the UK. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Fantastic.